Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Sylvia Amar. I'm a correspondent with CNBC, and it is a pleasure to see you all here today. Now, we're going to have a conversation here about the future of European security. And there's no doubt that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really changed the picture in Europe. Overnight, we saw, for instance, Germany sending weapons to Ukraine. And now more European countries are also suggesting that they will be spending more on defense. But some of the questions that I want to put to our panel here today will be looking at how can Europe build a safer future. And in order to do that, let me introduce to you our distinguished panel. I have Natalie Yarevo. She is a former finance minister of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Alexander Schellenberg, he's Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria. And another Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland. Thank you so much to all of you for joining me here today. I would like to start by asking you, Natalie, about the situation in Ukraine right now, because, of course, the situation, we know it's very complicated. We don't know how this is going to come to an end. And one of the big question marks is whether Ukraine will actually have to choose some sort of neutrality status going forward. Do you think that that is the path that Ukraine will eventually have to take?
I think that that question isn't the first thing on anyone's mind right now. I think prevailing, winning in the war is the first and foremost. To walk into any diplomatic conversation, negotiation, Ukraine has to be more certain that it's in a position of power. The president has said that Ukraine would consider neutrality, but I have to tell you that was not on day 90 tomorrow. So much more has happened, so many atrocities, so much devastation and destruction, things that we can't even imagine, having deported 232,000 children from the country to Russia. It's an ethnocide. And so statements that were made previously may not, unfortunately, remain options in the future. But I think it's something that Ukrainians, as the president said, will think about. It is in the Constitution that the pro-NATO position, so even if the president chose to make that part of a future negotiation, it would be up to the Ukrainian people, and they would need to vote. And so there may be a time when that becomes an option, but I can tell you that today, I don't think that that vote would be a positive one. And I think that the decision of Finland and Sweden to apply for membership will affect decision-making in Ukraine as well. So I wouldn't count on it as being a live option if this kind of atrocity continues at the level that we're seeing today.
And just to follow up on that, do you think that the decisions from Finland and Sweden could essentially inspire Ukraine, despite how complicated the situation is at the moment, to seek NATO membership even more going forward?
I think it's a very double-edged sword.
Yeah.
I think that it's been made perfectly clear that NATO's not prepared to provide membership to Ukraine. And after a war where it was not possible to convince NATO or members of NATO to provide for a no-fly zone, there's also a bit of disappointment with NATO in Ukraine. And so I think it's hard to say where this all lands. There is an enormous amount of gratitude to NATO countries, and more than NATO countries, beyond NATO countries, for the military support, for the financial support, for the humanitarian support. And I really believe that the focus, rather than on those outcomes, has to be on putting this war to an end. It is costly from a human perspective in Ukraine. It is morally, ethically incorrect. It is philosophically impossible to watch an autocrat, a tyrant, put a democracy to waste like this. It is something that has global economic effect. We know about the fuel costs in Europe, but now we're all coming to realize what's going to happen in the food system, and it's going to affect not only Europe, it's going to affect all of the world, whether or not we have famine. And there are many more effects that we're not yet even focused on. We talked about the neon production in Ukraine and its importance to the semiconductor industry, the role of Ukraine and Russia in titanium production, which is critical for airlines and automobiles and medical equipment. Ukraine is a critical part of the supply and logistics system of the global economy, and the longer this war continues, the costlier it is for all of the globe, not just Ukraine and not just Europe, Transatlantic Partnership. So I think the real focus needs to be on Ukraine prevailing and ending this war as soon as possible. And then all the other things will fall into place and decisions can be made that are rational. But until then, it's very hard for anyone in Ukraine to focus on NATO membership in a situation where they are alone physically fighting the second largest army in the world.
Mr. Schellenberg, back to the question of neutrality, Austria is in a very special situation. It is a neutral country. You're against any sort of military alliances. How can the Austrian situation serve as inspiration for Ukraine potentially in its future?
Well, I fully agree. We have to be very careful in calling out to the Ukrainians, giving them good suggestions from outside. What we are facing now is a breach of civilization, a blatant attack by the Russians, and we have to help the Ukrainian people to fight this attack back. That must be a prime goal now. And yes, there was a time about 7 years ago when we had even serious discussions with the then Ukrainian government about this option. But it's up, as it was the time for Austria in 1955, it's up to the Ukrainian people in the given time to take this decision. And now is not the time, I believe, to have this discussion. And on neutrality, every country is different. History is different, our geography is different, and we just discussed it beforehand. There is a difference between Finland, which has 1,300 kilometers together with Russia, a very own story, and Austria. We feel very much affected by it because the Ukrainian border is closer to Vienna than the westernmost province of Austria. And Austria is not a big country, and Ukraine has been part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, so there are parts of it at least. So there are, cultural bonds and a very strong emotional bond, but we are not neutral in the political sense. From day one on, Austria was very clear where we stand. And we stand on the side of the free world, we stand on the side of the West, of the European Union, and the Ukrainian people. The only thing is we have a narrowly interpreted military neutrality, which means we don't want to join a military alliance and we don't want foreign troops on Austrian soil. That's it, full stop.
And Alex, I would like to get your thoughts as well on the question of neutrality. Do you think this would be a good idea for Ukraine, given what you know from the Finnish experience?
Yeah, I guess I've been staving off this debate ever since the beginning of the war, and a little bit like Alexander, basically saying that it is up to the Ukrainians to take that decision. All I can do is to give the Finnish experience. We were neutral during the Cold War, but we were neutral out of necessity, not because of free will. This was our survivor tactique. And immediately when the Soviet Union collapsed, we ditched the doctrine of neutrality. We joined the European Union, forged a very close partnership with NATO, participated in all NATO exercises, went to Kosovo with KFOR and to Afghanistan with ISAF. So for us, it wasn't ideological. For Sweden, the case was different. They had been neutral for 200 years. And the reason, if I may, and I do this, under the watchful eye of Carl Bildt, my former colleague as a foreign minister, Sweden was able to be neutral because of Finland. We were the buffer zone between Sweden and the Soviet Union. And now that things changed on the ground overnight on the 24th of February, both countries decided, by the support of the public, to join NATO, and the rest is history. So is my answer go for neutralities? Probably not.
Well, let's hope that the rest is history.
All right.
Let's see about
Because
that.
if we're not then the buffer state, then you're going to have a different decision to make as well.
Exactly, Alexander.
It's going to be a chain reaction.
But public support in Austria is very different. We still have 80 to 20 or 70 to 30% in favor of neutrality.
Yeah.
And it has been a part of our self-definition to a certain degree. And this takes time. And I'm impressed by the change of tide in Finland and Sweden. And we're observing it. And there's a debate going on in Austria, rightfully so. But the debate in Austria is not so much about ditching neutrality and joining NATO, but what can Austria do to strengthen European security? What is our contribution? And that is, I believe, something where even a neutral state can have added value. And don't forget, Vienna is the seat of the UN, is the seat of the OSCE. and the only within the European Union. So there are other factors we have to put into calculation as well.
Yeah, and you've made clear in the past that for now, for the time being, in your country, in your situation, the question of neutrality still stands. But I would like to go back to the recent decision of Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Those applications have now been sent to NATO. But even before the invasion started, there was some sort of talk among European countries about the need to coordinate more their defense policies. There was even a thought about a potential EU army. But do you think, Alex, that now that Finland and Sweden have started their journey to join NATO, that what we're going to see going forward is a more European version of NATO and not so much a stronger European cooperation policy on defense?
It's hard to say. I've never belonged to the binary category of either or. I think both are useful. First qualifier, I'm a strong transatlanticist. I've always been an advocate of Finnish NATO membership. At the same time, I think we Europeans were naive on two accounts before this war began. The first one was on relying on Russian energy. We shouldn't have done that. And the second one was on relying completely on American security. Now, I think the first one should be ditched. That's fine, and we're going to do that. The second one, I think we're seeing a sort of a revival of the Transatlantic Alliance. So I don't think the Americans are going to go anywhere. But we do have to understand that Americans are not going to be there forever. We don't know whether Biden or Trump is a footnote of history. So I do think that we're moving probably towards a more European NATO, especially because Finland and Sweden obviously are going to be tremendous assets for the alliance up there in the northeastern part of Europe, where defense is extremely important because Finland has one of the largest standing armies in Europe, most sophisticated military equipment, completely compatible with NATO and the United States. So I think all of this talk about strategic autonomy inside the European Union is probably going to go a little bit to the back burner, and we'll see a stronger emphasis between the US and Europe. But again, I stress, this is not either or, we need to do both.
But Minister Schellenberg, if that is the case, if we do see a more European version of NATO, are you concerned that then within the EU, of which Austria is a member, the coordination, that cooperation will somehow get weaker?
No, actually, we have it already enshrined in the EU treaties. The goal, and it was at the very beginning of the European integration. Let's not forget the defense community was the first try of getting the European countries to coordinate, and it was ditched in 1954 in the Assemblée Nationale in Paris. So that was the first try, actually. And we have it in the treaty, and we always said, before joining, and when we three, Finland, Sweden, and Austria joined together, Austria already at that time said, yes, we are neutral, but we will be in full solidarity with the common foreign and security policy. And that's what we have proven day by day since the 1st of January 1995 when we joined. And so what I think, and that is not, and I see it like Alex, it's not either or. We can have within the European Union more pooling, more sharing, better spending the money, and we do not even apply the rules of the common market on the military infrastructure. That would be, for instance, a beginning. And just to give you an example of what Austria contributes, we have about offered 2% of the EU population, but 10% of our personnel in EU missions come from Austria. So that shows that we do contribute, and we're willing to do so, and we're not afraid of any debate on increasing the resilience of the European Union, even in defense capacities. EU army is something which is a headline, which is not around the corner, let's put it that way.
So the idea of an EU army is essentially dead?
No, it's not dead. It's something which is out there, but let's get our act together and put our money where our mouth is and start with, it's step by step. And I know you always need a big picture in the end of the day, but we have been talking since actually Saint-Malo, where the Brits and the French were coming together, and up to now, all this talking didn't lead to anything really. We don't have a European tank, we don't have a European airplane, so let's start by doing the things on the ground before talking about building a European army, which I have to say for Austria would be difficult because this would be a military alliance where we would then probably have a constructive abstention.
Exactly. Natalie, let me come back to you. And What would you say is the biggest priority for Ukraine? What would Ukraine need to contribute to a safer European architecture? Is it money? Is it European membership?
Right now, we need military support to win the war. We need to receive the military systems that we've asked for in order to prevail and end this as soon as possible. I think, honestly, someday, this is my personal opinion, I'm not a member of the government, someday NATO will understand that Ukrainian military forces have the most relevant experience that could be brought to NATO. There is no one who has the experience that the Ukrainian troops, the armed forces of Ukraine, has with fighting Russia. And someday, I'm hopeful that Europe will understand that and NATO will understand that. But aside from that, assume the war ends tomorrow. Just pray all night. I think that integration with Europe is absolutely key. Candidacy in June, moving to membership, abiding by EU treaty, Copenhagen rules, developing the institutions in the way that we become able to integrate fully with legal systems, with standards, with trade, with all of what the EU market means. That means open markets for Ukrainian goods, and very grateful for current step down or elimination of tariffs temporarily. But I think it's a critical difference when we look at Eastern Europe and the countries that did join the EU when the Berlin Wall fell, and Ukraine, which has not had that opportunity to date over the last 30 years since the Soviet Union fell. I think it's one of the critical reasons why the reform process has been so chaotic. We were never provided that set of rules, that set of tools, that path that would guide that reform process. Poland had that, Bulgaria had that, Romania had it. Now everyone went along their own path and succeeded more or less and more quickly and less quickly. But Ukraine needs that. And frankly speaking, Ukrainians are giving their lives every day for European values and have been since 2014 at least. Some would argue 2004 was the beginning of that process. And I think that they will strengthen Europe, not just because of the economy of Ukraine, but because of their incredible belief and defense in that freedom and in democracy. And I think Ukraine, in that way, strengthens Europe, while Europe strengthens Ukraine.
The problem, some would argue there, is that for some European countries, they are then not so supportive of other countries joining the EU. If they were to give membership to Ukraine, despite the difficulties on the ground, they would have to do that to other countries in the eastern part of Europe.
Moldova, Georgia, all have sent in their candidacy packages, so they deserve equal and appropriate treatment. And I think when I hear that certain countries don't believe it's necessary or don't see it happening, I guess I'd say, let's look at rule of law. There's a treaty that defines that all European states are eligible. They have to meet certain criteria, and I'm not arguing about the criteria, but if a country is meeting those criteria, I don't think it's up to another country to say, but not you. I just don't think that's what the treaty says.
Exactly.
That is not the freedom and democracy that the European Union represents. It's not, in my mind at least, not what the European Union is.
Minister Schellenberg, given your experience within the EU, do you think that the June date that keeps being mentioned, is it feasible to give some sort of reassurances to Ukraine, to give this candidacy status, or is it too early for the EU?
First of all, I fully underline what you said, and I believe we have to respect this aspiration. Yes, Ukraine is a European country, and we have to understand that emotionally what they're doing is completely right and understandable. And I believe if we talk about security, security doesn't begin at the EU border. We have to think about our neighborhood, and we have to rethink completely the concept we have of neighborhood policy. Eastern Partnership is basically dead. And yes, I believe we have to give a very clear signal that we want Ukraine to be clearly anchored in the European family, in this family of values and rule of law. And the same, and I'm happy to hear Moldova and the Southern Caucasus. And I would add one more region which is close to the heart of Vienna, that's the Western Balkans. We have given 19 years ago in Thessaloniki the promise to each and every Balkan state, yes, we will join the European family. Since then, Too little has happened. We have two countries waiting for the opening of accession negotiations. One of them even changed the name, North Macedonia. We have one country waiting for 2 years now to get the candidate status. And with Serbia and Montenegro, things are not really progressing. I believe we have to put our money where our mouth is, and this is now the litmus test. Either we export stability and security, or we risk importing it. And I believe, and I heard,
You're not even risking it. It's happening to you today.
yeah.
That instability is yours today.
And I believe, but the point is, and that might be a nuance, simply giving you an etiquette, candidate country, doesn't impress the Russians, doesn't impress anything, doesn't change anything for the Ukrainian people. We have to think very hard how to, emotionally, yes, but let's look at the Balkans. We have to, and that's what my line is, we have to think how to give life to it, how to make it tangible. And yes, without losing the perspective out of sight, we have to think, why not integrate in the energy, in the research policies, in the trans-European networks, you know, to have a gradual integration, step by step, and even then, get the countries already in the working groups in Brussels, so they learn and they're there. We can split the meetings in half, so you have a formal meeting where the decisions are taken, and an informal where you have this decision, you know, shaping and exchange. So there's enough fantasy. And Alex and I, we were working on these things, flexible integration, all of that years ago. And I believe now is a time to bring these ideas out of the drawer again, because we have to get our act together in the Western Balkans and the immediate neighborhood, because this is part of the immediate security policy of the European Union.
So what is the answer to all of these questions, Alex? Because President Macron, for instance, has spoken about this new idea of a European political community, but that does not seem to be what Ukrainians actually want.
No, and I think they shouldn't want that either. I mean, my simple, Alexander and I, we were young civil servants working on the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. So we're EU nerds, right? So we get kicks out of this stuff. So my thesis here is that we should have a European Confederation. And that has 3 layers. Layer number 1, the European Union. So that's the 27. Layer number 2, European communities, which are all the candidate countries aspiring for membership. So there's a clear path, just like Alexander said, to join. And I actually think candidate state is more than symbolic, especially in New York. You know, I think it's important. I understand I'm not taking the decisions anymore. It's going to be complicated and the rest of it. But I think we need to do that. Because if we want to be serious about a geopolitical Europe and exporting security, then these guys need to have a path. And that means Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and the Balkans. Then we have a 3rd layer, which I call the European area, which is the countries that don't want to necessarily join the EU, but should be involved. UK, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. And these 40 countries, which have 3 different layers of membership in the EU, if you will, they come together twice a year with the big prime ministers and presidents together, and then they come together with the ministers, and then, of course, they do the working group stuff. And this basically sends a signal to the rest of the world. Here is Europe. It's the 40 of us with a little bit of flexibility in the system, and then we focus on energy policy, security, internal market, and the rest of it. Very simple, right?
More European summits.
But the important thing, if I
Let me come back.
if I might just add, we have been always thinking in templates. It's either membership, or it's association agreement, or it's simply free trade. And I believe we have, or the economic area, which nobody's talking about. But I believe we have to leave this behind, and I fully agree, we have to show flexibility. And the fact is, we need a European community, economic and values community, to show to the outside world, these are countries that stand together, that work together, where there's mobility, economic exchange, and common values and common sets of rules. And there we need a degree of flexibility.
What do you make of all of this?
I respect both of you tremendously, and I understand the categories you've described, Alex, and what you're describing. I just want to make sure that underlying that is not some kind of second-class citizenship.
No. That's the Macron idea.
When you say that, exactly, Macron, but and even the Eastern Partnership, with all due respect, it started out as one thing, but it ended up being just a second-class citizenship for European countries. No. If you're talking about an area that shares common values, there is no one that we can argue today shares those values less. They are dying for those values and have been for over 8 years. And I just think, again, I'm not suggesting that you change the criteria of the path, but candidacy is an absolute possibility in June. It is a political decision in June. It is a political decision. And
But we have
after
to.
candidacy, the path and the process and the
That's the point.
criteria, that's not political, that's real.
Yeah.
That's meeting, obligations. It's the institutional strengthening, it's reform, no question.
But there we have to think harder, because if we look at the Western Balkans, they have been so enthusiastic, they have been so supportive of the European Union, and now we have a growing sense of frustration. Because after 20 years, 19 years, nothing has happened. And we have to prevent this of happening in Ukraine, in Moldova, and to have it growing in the Balkans. And that's why my concern is to make it tangible, to get success and step forwards and progress, without losing the goal out of sight. That's the important thing. But the goal might be 15, 20 years ahead, or we don't know it. We don't know it. It took many countries 10 years.
Let's just look at what's happening right now with the blockade of the ports and the imminent famine, food crisis, I don't know what else we want to call it, hunger across the world. We are desperately seeking ways to change the Ukrainian rail to be more efficiently shipping product that we can't ship through the ports through Europe to European ports, whether it's Varna in Bulgaria or through the Danube. We are desperate to integrate right now for the globe, not just for Ukraine and not just for Europe, for the globe. I just think that urgency has to be number one. And I don't want to in any way exclude the Balkans. I agree with you. They should be there as well. But if everyone's on the candidate side are taking the steps, then it is up to you to welcome them and make this urgent. But clearly, it's in everyone's interest, clearly.
Let's see how far the European leaders will go then when they meet in June. We don't have much time left, but I would still like to get your thoughts on the question of where Europe should be looking to form new allies. Because quite recently, Josep Borrell made the comment that Europe, the West as a whole, need to find new allies. China is, of course, not saying very much about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Countries in South America, for instance, are quite reticent about saying anything against Russia. So where should the EU be looking to form new friends, Alex?
Probably flexible alliances. First observation is that we're too Eurocentric on this crisis in the sense that we think this is about Russia versus the West. It's much broader than that. The war in Ukraine has ignited a bigger debate about the new global world order. It's an uncomfortable debate for us Europeans and the North Americans to have because we fully realize that we've got more to lose than to gain on this one. I think we're moving towards a world where we have flexible alliances. And that means that it's not going to be as black and white as it was during the Cold War when it was bipolar, or even during the post-Cold War when it was rather unipolar. And democracy, the end of history concepts were sometimes exported by force, like in Iraq, or sometimes being a failure, like in Afghanistan. So we probably need to be a little bit more flexible in our thinking. And may I add also, this is going to mean that in some cases we're going to have to cooperate with countries that we don't feel that comfortable with. Final point on this, I think there was a wonderful article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times talking about the empire of lies, which is Russia, but then there's the empire of hypocrisy, which is us in the West, because, we have a certain value set, but sometimes we sacrifice those values to do stuff with people who don't exactly agree with what we do. And I think this is the reality that we need to face up with. I call it dignified foreign policy. You call it what you will.
Minister Schellenberg, to finish off, has the West and the EU in particular been too hypocritical and failed to cultivate allies across the world?
I wouldn't call it hypocritical. I would say we're a little bit naive. We still thought after the fall of the Iron Curtain that Francis Fukuyama might be right, and that sort of our model of life, which we obviously consider to be the best, would sort of spreads peacefully across the planet, and that sooner or later the Russians would move our way, and even the Turks and everybody. And then we had a sort of a hangover time where we woke up, and a couple of years ago the European Union said on Russia, engage, constrain, push back on China's systemic rivalry. And we never expected for the 24th of February to happen, but it did happen. Yeah. And it's like a shock therapy for us. And now we have to get our act together, and naivety is gone. Holidays from history is over. We had 30 years of holidays.
Very final thoughts, Natalie.
You said hypocrisy, you said naivete, and I'll say some of it is just greed. Because we had plenty of warning since the Munich Security Conference when Putin announced his war against the liberal order, to the war in Chechnya. What happened in Grozny is the same as what you see in Aleppo, which is the same thing that you see in Mariupol. Take a look at the photos. It is hard to identify one set of dust and rubble from another. He has invaded Georgia. He invaded Ukraine. Each and every time he shot down MH17. We have the Litvinenko murder in London. There are murders in Berlin. What more did we need to know about his stated, published intentions? He published an op-ed last summer suggesting that the Ukrainian people have no right to exist. Now he's acting out on that ethnocide, on that genocide. I think it's greed. I think our businesses are happier right now, and many of them from many countries, from the United States through Germany, everyone, continuing to do business in Russia, continuing to pay taxes in Russia, continuing with their taxes to finance war crimes, while the taxpayers in our countries are paying to battle that same war crime. Yeah. There's something illogical here, and the only thing that comes down to is got to be an element, at least, of greed.
Thank you so much. I would spend the rest of the afternoon speaking with the three of you, but I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you as well for following our conversation.